If you've seen my channel before, you know that I love trying out new watercolours to see what unusual colours they might be and how they behave. So when Paul Rubens said, would I like to try these youlan watercolours, I said, yes, please. So join me and I'll swatch them all out, and then yep, I have been using them. I'll share some of the pictures that I've been painting with them. My name's Liz Chadderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I share tips, tricks or techniques that I wish I'd known about ages ago. They've arrived, and they've also very kindly, which was a bit of a surprise, sent some watercolour paper for me to try them out on. And if I get this out and wiggle it around, does that show up? It's got sparkles in it. I'm not sure why you'd want sparkly watercolour paper, but hey, let's try it. The watercolour paper, my Chinese is not very good, but I can recognise 300, so I presume it is 300 grams per square metre. Now, let's look. It says it's the 5th generation of artist level solid watercolour pigments. I've done reviews of Paul Rubens paint before, they're tube paints, and I've really enjoyed them, so I've got high hopes. Very nice packaging. Cloth. Is that, am I meant to clip it clean? Probably won't. A little leaflet with a colour sheet, that's always useful. And a sparkly swatch card as well, that's good. And then of course the most important thing, the paints. So we've got a classic tin with 24 colours in. I just turn it over. It has got a ring, so if you were wanting to hold it, it has got a thumb ring. That's useful. And it's got some nice deep mixing wells. Right, let me unwrap all these. Won't make you watch doing that. And then we'll do some swatching and see what we think to them. Since I filmed that opening, life has happened, and you can see that I have been using these paints quite a lot. But I promised I would swatch them out, so I will come back now and swatch them out, and I'll show you some of the paintings I've been doing using the paints and using the paper. I've been doing 30 faces in 30 days challenge, and I ended up using these paints for about the second half of the challenge, and I have really enjoyed them. So just before we start swatching, I wanted to let you know that all of the paints are rated as 4 or 5 stars in terms of Lightfastness, which is fantastic. Price wise, you'll want to know, in the UK they're £49.99. Canada, well, I've put £69. That should be dollars, of course, sorry, 69 Canadian dollars. At the moment, I think they're out of stock in America, but you can get them on AliExpress. So they are artist quality. I think I've already mentioned that youlan means orchid born in a valley. If I haven't, that's what it does mean. And they're this 5th generation with improved pigments and improved manufacturing. Let's swatch them out. I've put this black line here, which will help us judge the opacity of the pigments. I've put their ratings so we know what we're looking for. And I've put all the pigment numbers here as well. So we'll go through, see what we think, and I can tell you a bit about how much which colours I've enjoyed and used. Well, you can probably see some I've hardly touched, some I've used. Naples Yellow is one I just haven't touched at all. It is a very opaque yellow. It's fine, it's just not my favourite colour. We'll judge the opacity when they're dry, because that's a far more realistic test. That's a 3 pigment mix. Most of them, as you can see, are single pigments, which is great. Lemon yellow is rather a nice colour, and I have used this quite a lot in portraits. I've enjoyed that. And I have to say that I found that pretty transparent, whereas some lemons are incredibly opaque. Cadmium Yellow Light is my next one. And again, I've been using this a lot in portraits, mixed with maybe cadmium red or one of the other reds to make a pretty sort of orangey skin tone. So PY35, nice cadmium yellow light. We then go on to chromium yellow, which you can see both of these are pretty cool yellows, and then we just go on to a real egg yolk yellow that is very orangey, very warm. Let's just thin that out so you can see what it's like when we've added more water. And it stays really nice and warm and very orangey. I have been using, and you can see by the state of this paint, let's clean that up, poor thing, chromium orange a lot. Chromium orange, and so I see that's still a bit mucky. I do apologise. I am a mucky painter. That's how I am. But chromium orange with a bit of cobalt blue and chromium orange makes a really good sort of gungy brown, which is another great hair colour. So I've been using a lot more chromium orange than I would ever expect. If you look at the state of this cadmium red light, I have used loads of that because I have been doing portraits, and I was just not really a fan of cadmium red. But God, I've used loads in the past couple of weeks and I'm really warming to it. There's your PR 108. Now, I don't know about you. Some people are, well, they describe themselves as pigment nerds, and some people aren't. I don't make any effort to remember all the different pigments and to know particular properties. Sometimes I look them up because I want to try and match across brands and things. So don't feel that you have to memorize all these. But if you want to think, oh, how can I mix that colour? Incredibly useful. We'll come to a couple of the mixes later on. There was a really nice olive green, I think, that it's worth looking at the pigment mix and thinking, oh yeah, I could do that. I can't say that. Perylene Maroon is a wonderful sort of browny red mixed with a sap green, makes a fantastic skin tone. Such a good colour. So I am very fond of Perylene Maroon. Then we're coming on to Quin Rose here. I like any of the Quins. Look at that. If you were doing a portrait of a young child with really sort of pink, beautiful cheeks, you know, all flushed with youth, Quin Rose is very, very pretty. Let's move on to Quin Maroon here. Oh, no, I won't. Sorry, that's Dioxazine Violet. I do apologise. Put my brush in the wrong one. That is not Quin Maroon. So that's your Diox Violet, PV23. Lovely colour. Now, what am I going to do here? Let's lift as much as possible, which won't be an awful lot because Dioxazine Violet is an incredibly staining colour, as you can see, but let's get the most off that I can. And let's concentrate. So what had I done? I'd done my Cad Red, Perylene Maroon, Quin Rose. Here we go, Quin Maroon. Again, just as I said before, I am very fond of all the Quins, from Quin Gold to Quin Rose to Quin Scarlet to Quin anything. I just love the transparency, and that Quin Maroon is really lovely. We'll see how it dries down because that Quin Rose has already faded, so the Quin Rose Maroon is actually a little bit more zhuzhy. Now let's go on to indigo. This is an indigo hue because real indigo comes from plants and is very fugitive. So I don't think many people, I'm sure you can get real indigo, but this is not it. And you probably, unless you're a very specialist sort of painter, don't want the real indigo because it is so fugitive. So that's a mix of phthalo blue and a black pigment to get that really deep gorgeous blue. We have what they're calling French blue, French ultramarine, lovely warm summer sky blue. This is Berlin blue, which is what I would usually call, or we would call, Prussian blue. One of my favourite blues, got that real green undertone, or green tinge, an undertinge, I don't know if that's such a word, but lovely colour, beautifully, well, I would say beautifully transparent, but they are describing it as semi-opaque. That'll be interesting to see when we actually judge that. Next we have phthalo blue, which I have to say, again, one of my favourite blues, simply because it is so bright, so transparent, and such a staining colour. Gosh, you can't ever get that out of your paintings, or indeed your fingers. But beautiful colour, phthalo blue. Then we have a translucent or transparent turquoise. I hardly use this colour, simply because I've been painting portraits and it just hasn't featured in them, but I can imagine that I will use it in kingfishers and other paintings. Very, very pretty colour. We then get on to oriental green, which is PG7, so a sort of hooker's green. And again, lovely and vibrant. Let's try and judge the colour shift, because some paints have such a colour shift from being beautifully vibrant when wet like this, and then they dry and you're like, oh, where have they gone? But we'll make that judgment here. Moving on to May green, which is one of the mixes of PY151 and PG7, so it's got that oriental green in it. It's pretty lurid, isn't it? I'm not sure what I would be using that for. That's possibly my least favourite colour in here, but maybe if you're adding a touch of pink, touch of red, you could calm it down and turn it into a nice useful green. Then we have cobalt turquoise dark, which I expect to be very opaque because the cobalts tend to be. That's PG26. So it's, if I looked at that, it's not a pigment I'm at all familiar with, but if I looked at that, I would be calling that a green rather than a turquoise, and I would expect that to granulate as well. It'll be hard to assess granulation on this particular paper. A rougher paper will be good for assessing granulation, but the cobalts tend to granulate if that's something you're looking for. Now this olive green is PO62, which was that chromium orange we've already tried, mixed with the PG7, that hooker's green. And I think this is a rather nice green. Finding that pretty transparent, whereas they describe it as semi-opaque. So I am interested in seeing where we get to. Here's Earth Yellow, so that's a yellow ochre, and that is really nice. And again, in portraits, that is such a handy colour. It's a really good basis for skin tones. I've used lots of that, as you can see. Come on to the burnt sienna. Again, pretty useful in painting people for lovely darker skin tones or really warm colours going into hair. And that's a mix of PR101 and PBK9. This is Venetian red, which is a nice colour, but I've hardly used it just because of the things I've been painting. So that's PR101. Quite opaque, and I do tend to go towards the most transparents. Brown umber is very, very dark. It's got almost a greeny tinge to it because it's got PB15 in it. So you might expect it to be a bit bluer, but I find it a really green one. Wouldn't say that was my favourite sort of umber that I've used, but again has been pretty handy in the paintings I've been doing. And then ivory black. And it's quite interesting to see the brown umber against the black, because it does show up that sort of green tinge to it. And again, I very, very rarely use black in my work. Yes, I thought you might be interested to see which colours I needed to add into the palette, the ones that I found missing. I added in some of this, which was the Quin Violet, just because I was finding this mixed with the yellow ochre or making some great colours for portraits. I added in cobalt blue. That, I think, is a real gap in this particular palette. A cobalt blue would have been really handy to have. Kind of wish, what would I have got shot of? That's always an interesting question. You know, that Quin Violet is a specialist colour. I feel that cobalt blue could have been handy in here, and I might have got rid of that May green and added in the cobalt blue. I think at one point I added in, which red? I think that was a Pyrrole red, just because for one particular painting that I was doing that I wanted a really good Pyrrole red, and I added that into my palette, just put a little squidge in there. That's what those three colours I missed when I was painting portraits with this set, and of those, the one that I really think would have been handy to have was cobalt. Should Paul Rubens be looking at watching my film, bung in some cobalt, please. Get shot of that May green, I reckon, because you should be mixing up your own greens. You've got 4 greens in here, and I really don't see any need for that May green, but cobalt would have been really handy to have. Let's try this and then have a look at the opacity and see what we think to the colours. Opacity, the Naples Yellow is very opaque, and you can see it sitting on top of that black line. They say that the cadmium yellow light is semi-opaque, and I can see a little bit, but not a huge amount. What does surprise me is their assessment of perylene maroon as being semi-opaque, and I really can't see anything there. And the rest are pretty good. Even that Venetian red, which they rate as opaque, I'm not seeing a huge amount sitting on top of that black line. The cobalt, that cobalt turquoise dark is pretty opaque, so that's what we'd expect. But on the whole, they are quite transparent. I didn't see a lot of a colour shift either from wet, apart from particularly that Quin Rose, which fresh out of the pan is absolutely lovely, and then just goes off a little bit. The Quin Maroon seems to hold its oomph a bit more. I've been using this set, as I say, and I've found that they release their colour really nicely. There isn't any scrubbing to sort of try and get colour coming up. It's released nicely. They seem highly pigmented. So that's all been incredibly positive. So let's look at some of the paintings I use both the paper and the pigments for. Say, this was the 30 Faces, 30 Days challenge with Sktchy. If you've never heard of it, it's worth having a look. I was actually teaching on this as well, so I pre-recorded some lessons, and I decided to do the challenge and paint along. So this was the first day that I used the sparkly paper. Let me wiggle her around, and I don't know if you can see the sparkles. I really couldn't get my head around why I would want to have sparkly watercolour paper. If I painted fairies and fantasy figurines, maybe I would, but I used it for this because well, when else would I use it? And generally, I did find it very nice paper. My only thing with it, well, it held quite a lot of water, so that if you were doing wet and wet and wanting to get sort of gradations in the skin, it was very useful for that. It held a lot of water and let you work for quite some time. What I didn't find so good was its lifting capabilities. I think there's one later where I was trying to lift along the jawline to soften that off, because I'd sort of cut it out a bit too much. And I just found that the paper started to pill a little. So its lifting capability wasn't great, but its layering was. A lot of these challenges or days I was trying to paint like the tutor. This is not my own natural style, so some of them were really hard work. Anyway, I used the pigments, and you can see that we've got some really nice soft wet in wet marks, as well as the crisper wet on dry. So they were great. Now, I use those pigments. This is not their paper, the Paul Rubens paper, as you can see from the size of it, but I use their pigments on this. It's with an artist called Drayton Duro, who uses incredibly intense, beautiful colours. I was really pleased with how this turned out in terms of the vibrancy and the movement on the paper. So the pigments in that little box really work their socks off for this. I also love that it's pretty reactive on the paper surface. So for example, this big water bloom I've got here, which I find absolutely appropriate for where it is placed, because the sun is shining on his bald head. The paints do move on the surface really nicely. Let's look a little at a few others. So this lesson was all about shadows. This woman was standing next to a sort of chicken wire fence, so she had the shadows of the fence on her face. And she was actually great fun to paint. And I really liked how the paints merged and worked with each other, and the colours in that, so you can get, say, these nice soft marks as well as then the crisp ones. I thought this was one of my more successful ones. He was great fun to paint, again with lots of soft wet in wet and then harder marks. I think this was the lady, yeah, where the paper did not behave itself. I'm not sure whether you can see, but I realised I'd been a little harsh with her chin here and wanted to lift, and I found the paper started to mark. That was possibly the only one that I really noticed that pilling. And then this was the last day. So at this point, this is probably the only portrait, because it's of this very young, angelic looking girl, where I felt that maybe that sparkly paper came into its own, along with a lot of that quin rose and that quin maroon, to bring out that sort of soft peachy cheek of hers. So there you go. Those are the swatches. That was a little bit of the really putting it into action. That is what the paint tin looks like after having painted probably about 10 portraits with it. So you can see that a little is going a long way. Really nice tin that I have made an utter mess of, but I don't believe that your art materials should be pristine. I think there's, if someone's got terribly neat paint tin, it probably means they're not using it enough. I think this is a really nice set if you're looking for something to use on the move and you like using pan colours. The colours are really vibrant and interesting. There are some unusual ones in this, like having that Perylin maroon makes me very happy. My only gripe was the lack of the cobalt blue, and I will either swap out that Naples yellow or the May green and put some in there. And then for me, that's a really nice little set.